Yang saya hormati Kepala Biro Kerjasama dan Sistem Informasi Bapak. Mungkin kita akan perkenalan dulu tentang biografi dari Profesor Dr. Morse. Dipersilakan, Miss.
Selamat pagi. Saya senang sekali di sini. Terima kasih semua hadir hari ini. Saya terima kasih ke Pak Intam dan Profesor Rektor Pak Jeffrey Watimina dan semua dosen dan mahasiswa di sini. Terima kasih. Saya mahasiswa S3 PhD dari Simon Fraser University di Fakultas Biologi. Saya senang sekali kalau dosen saya bisa hadir hari ini kasih kuliah umum. Saya akan kasih tahu sedikit tentang Prof. Arno Morse selesaikan S1 tentang biologi di McGill University di Kanada. Sesudah itu Prof ambil S3 PhD di Oxford University tentang zoologi. Habis itu dia ikut penelitian di beberapa lokasi dengan training dengan Prof. Dolph Hunter di Vancouver di UBC, Universitas British Columbia. Sesudah itu beliau juga penelitian di Universitas Amsterdam dan juga jadi Prof besar di Simon Fraser University sesudah itu tahun 2001. Prof Arna ada Prof khusus untuk Biodiversity, Ecology, and Evolution, Phylogenetics di Simon Fraser University. Beliau juga adalah bantu pemerintah Kanada sebagai advisor ke ministry Kementerian Environment di Kanada juga bantu untuk bikin keputusan tentang hewan-hewan yang at risk. Jadi beliau sangat ahli tentang konservasi dan juga hari ini akan kasih kuliah umum tentang konservasi the tree of life. So terima kasih Pak Arna dan terima kasih semua.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Honored to be here to speak with you today. The title of my talk, as you've heard, is Conserving the Tree of Life. And I will explain in a bit to help her with her research. So thank you very much. Okay. So, this is the title of an influential article that was published some time ago in the journal Nature, which is an international journal, which suggested that we could not conserve everything on Earth. We had to make decisions about which species we save and which species we let go, because we cannot conserve everything. And this is a very profound statement, that we cannot conserve everything. So what do we do given this question? Well, a long time ago, a very famous biologist, who was a conservation biologist at Harvard University, E.O. Wilson, suggested that what we really need to conserve is information. So you are all at a technical university, you understand what I mean when I say information. In biology, information is coded in the genes, right? Information that you have is inside your genes. And so what he suggested we do was to conserve that information. So we have to think about the information. Now, how would you do that? That is the thesis of this talk. Now we know there's a problem. So here, I hope you can see this because the screen is small. But so this is just an example. Indonesia is one of the most biodiverse, species-rich countries in the world. It's in the top 5. You all know this, yes? You are living in one of the most important countries in the world with respect to this information. There are about 730 mammal species that live in Indonesia. There are about 300 species that live only in Indonesia. About 20% of those species are at risk of extinction. 1 in 5. You can do the math yourself as to how many species that is. So about 20% of the mammal species that only live in Indonesia, that you have full responsibility over, are at risk of extinction. And that number, 20%, 1 in 5, is about average for the whole world. So if you look globally, not just in Indonesia, if you look globally across the world, this is a paper, an older paper, that looked at the proportion of species that are at risk in different groups. You see a silhouette of shark, amphibians, mammals, reptiles. On average, it's about between 20 and 25%. So between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. So we know there's a problem. I'm just going to wait. Just keep coming in. We'll wait until they sit down. It's quiet. Okay, so hold that thought. We have a problem, right? 1 in 5 species are at some risk of being lost forever. We know we can't save them all, and we know, or one idea, is that it's not the species that we're in charge of stewarding, it's the information that's in their genes. So, what is the tree of life? Well, when you say the word tree, we don't mean a tree, like an ironwood tree. But what we mean is that everything on Earth is related to everything else. Right? All the plants, animals, all the species are related one to another. And we can represent those relationships with a tree. Because evolution happens through time, And species give rise to new species. Some go extinct, and they give rise to new species. That biodiversity is organized in a very particular way. It is hierarchically arranged. So for instance, we just take our close relatives, and we take this lovely, wonderful chimpanzee. It's one species in a genus called Pan. Both those species are inside that genus. Humans are in the genus, what's the genus for humans? Does anyone know? Homo, right? So we're members of the genus Homo. We used to have other relatives, like the Neanderthals, but they went extinct. So we're the only species in that genus. And likewise, there are 2 species of gorilla, and there are at least 2 species of orangutan, maybe 3. One of them lives right here in the backyard. So this is how evolution has created biodiversity in these nested sets. And these species are all in a single family, the hominid. Now, how did those species arise? They arose through evolution, through time. So if you think of, in the past, there was a single ancestor of all of those species, and then slowly through time, they split, those lineages split, and they split, and they split again. So this is how these species are related to each other. And we represent those relationships with a tree. And you'll see, I don't know why I'm using a tree. You'll see here, you have the past, and then through time up to the present. So that is a tiny part of the tree of life. Just our part. That's where you sit in the tree of life. So evolution creates diversity, biodiversity, via divergence, change through time. And we can represent that with this phylogenetic tree. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Good. If it doesn't, if I say something that makes no sense, you should put your hand up and say, that makes no sense. And then I can try to explain that. Now, remember this divergence happens through time. So now I want you to think. Every year, a year passes, and a little bit of evolution happens. Some organisms die, some new ones are born, they're a little bit different than their parents, and things are changing a little bit every year. And indeed, it is not incorrect to say something like, every year, the mammal tree of life, which has about 6,000 species, gains 6,000 years of evolution every year. Because every one of those species has evolved just a little bit from the past to the present, to the next year. Now that's kind of a strange way to think about evolution, but it actually isn't incorrect. Usually we think of millions of years, but every year a little bit of evolution happens across all of the species on Earth. So we can say that the tree grows every year, by a year, and every species is doing it. There are 6,000 species of mammal, and so there's 6,000 years of evolution every year. Now remember, many of these species are at risk of extinction. Oh, so I have another example here. There are about 10,000 species of bird. So that part of the tree grows 10,000 years per year. Yeah? So that's what we're getting every year. However, if we lose a single species, we don't just lose 1 year of evolution, we lose all of the evolution that gave rise to that species. A mammal species, on average, is between 3 and 5 billion years old. We're about 6 billion years old. Our closest relative, we split off from our closest relative about 6 million years ago. And everything else is gone extinct. So you represent 6 million years of evolution that no other species has on Earth. So we only gain 1 year per species, but if we lose a species, we lose many orders of magnitude more evolution. And recall, there are 18 mammal species that are critically endangered, very close to being to going extinct in Indonesia alone. So 18 times 4 on average, that's just an average, will tell you how many millions of years of evolution are at risk in Indonesia. Just those that are found only in Indonesia. So it's a lot, right? So any one of those species goes extinct, we lose way more evolution than we gain from just all the other species evolving. So it's not equal. All right. So now we go back to this idea. Conservation's aim should be the preservation of the information content contained in the DNA of all species on Earth. So how might we try to do this in the context of not being able to save everything? Well, if we think of this tree as representing the divergence that occurred from the past to the present, we can also think about this as being representing the information concerning solved evolutionary problems. Because everything that's alive today is alive because it adapted to the environment. It solved past evolutionary problems. Because if it didn't, it would be extinct. Just like the Neanderthals went extinct, they did not solve the relevant evolutionary problems required for them to remain. So you can think of this tree as containing information about solved evolutionary problems, i.e. information. Some of that information is shared, right? We all contain, if you look at the green segment on the tree there, where the arrow is pointing, that is divergence and information that's shared by humans, gorillas, and chimps. You see? It's the common ancestor of those three groups, and so we all share that information. That, in orange, is the information that no other species shares with one another. Right? That's the evolution that occurred and solved problems that were solved only in that lineage. So we have shared information and unique information, and put those together. The branch lengths, the actual time that transpired. Remember, if you look on the y-axis, we see time from 18 million years ago up to the present. Branch lengths represent time and represent the information. So the branch length may actually be a measure of what E.O. Wilson suggested we focus on. And if that's the case, then what we should do is to conserve as much of the tree as possible. Not the species, but the tree. And that becomes the thesis of this presentation. There are two parts to the thesis. We can measure biodiversity, millions of years of evolution on the tree, and we try to conserve as much of the tree as possible. Does that make sense? All right. First, we need trees. So this is a very funny diagram, which which is actually a phylogenetic tree, where the past is in the middle of the circle, and all of the species are around the edge. So these lines are very thin, so I don't know if you can see them, but these are all 5,800 species of mammals, all around the edges, and right in the middle is the past, going back about 200 million years. If you add all of those branch lengths together from that tree, in just the same way as I showed you with the small tree, that adds up to 35.6 billion years of evolution. Right? And remember I said we can measure biodiversity in millions of years. So that represents almost 36 billion years of biodiversity. There you are over there, just as where you are on the tree, way over on that side. Next to all the other primates. So we have a number for the total amount of evolution for mammals. We have the same thing for birds. Remember I said there's about 10,000 species of bird. This is the tree. The middle, right in the middle of the circle is the past, when birds first started to diversify, and around the tips, around the outside of the circle, are the name, I took the names out, but we're all 10,000 species. And that tree represents 77 billion years of evolution. So now we can talk about how much biodiversity Indonesia has, not in terms of the number of species, but in terms of the millions of years of evolution. So remember I said Indonesia was one of the 5 richest countries in the world for biodiversity. Indeed, for mammals, which is at the top, you have almost 12% of the entire tree of mammals in Indonesia. And if you look at just those species that are found only in Indonesia, you have almost 4% of the entire tree of mammals. And likewise, you have about 14% of the bird tree in Indonesia, and 3% is found only in Indonesia. So you steward a very large proportion of the tree of life of mammals and a very large portion of the tree of life of birds, just in your very large and varied country. So this is another way of thinking about biodiversity. Yeah? 3.7%, 3.25%. Okay, so now let us think about this what to let go question. Remember I said the thesis that you can measure biodiversity in millions of years, and we should try to conserve as much of it as possible. So what happens if, unfortunately, someone said, we only have enough money to conserve 3 species in this small tree? You would ask, which ones would you choose? Well, we can choose 2 chimpanzees, highlighted in yellow, and 1 of the gorillas. Don't worry about us, we're going to conserve us. We'll always be here. If everything else goes extinct, which means losing the gorilla and your orangutan, then this is how much tree we would have left. Right? That would be our tree that was left. That would be the information that we would have preserved. However, and you can probably see this logically, if you wanted to conserve more information, then it would make more sense to conserve an orangutan, 1 orangutan at least, 1 gorilla at least, and 1 chimpanzee at least. So if you preserve those 3 species, and you got rid of the others, then that would be your tree. This tree has more information than this tree. Right? If you add up all the time, all the millions of years, this tree is longer, has more information than this tree. So this offers a reasonable and justifiable way to choose among sets of species for conservation, if you have to. So we should choose this set. This is basically the Noah's Ark approach to conservation. So the myth of Noah's flood brought two of all the species together and put them on the ark to save them before the large flood. This is just saying, instead of taking two of everything, we choose judiciously which ones to put on the ark. Unfortunately, we don't do conservation that way. We focus on individual species. We have organizations that look after orangutans. We have organizations that try to conserve chimpanzees. We have organizations that try to conserve killer whales and all sorts of things, corals. We tend to focus on individual species, not groups of species. Zoo breeding programs, endangered species acts focus on individual species. So we need some way to take this idea of preserving information in millions of years and be able to attach a value to every species independently. My graduate student a few years ago came up with a way to do that. You guys can scribble down that equation if you like, since you're all in technical university, but I'm just going to show you an example of how we do it. All we do is we take the phylogenetic tree and we cut it up and give all the branches, cut the branches up and give the branches to the species. So we apportion the entire tree, all of the information, to individual species as a function of how much of it is unique and how much of it is shared. So we take the Bornean orangutan, for instance. We would say it gets all of its own unique information, and it gets half of the information that it shares with the other species. That is how much information you would give, that's the value you would give to that species. Do the same for the other species, and you do the same for all the other species in the tree. I hope you can see that I've just colored all of the branches in a way that adds up the entire tree and is the value of that species. And we call this the fair proportion measure of biodiversity. And as you might expect, the orangutan score high. They are the most valuable primate because they have the fewest close relatives. They're on long branches and they contain a lot of information that other species do not. Whereas the chimps and the gorillas share information with us because we all arose in Africa together. The chimps and the orangutan were here long before. And those relatives went extinct. So different groups have different average measures of isolation, average measures of value. Of course, older groups that have smaller groups and older groups are more valuable. This is just a measure of different groups of organisms. Birds at the bottom, then mammals, crocodiles, etc., going up, sharks, and their average on the x-axis is their average value. And for some species, we already knew. Oh, no, I should say this before I say that. I should say this way of taking information from a tree and dividing it up amongst the species. Actually, if you choose species based on that, you do get the total information content. So this is just some work done by another graduate student of mine that looked for mammals, birds, and also for amphibians here, 3 different groups. We have on the x-axis a measure of the information per species as we add them together or take them away from a tree. And on the y-axis, we have how much total information is lost on the tree. And they correlate almost perfectly. So there's a direct link between the Noah's Ark version and the individual species version, which means we can use the individual species version to make inferences. So there were some highly isolated species that we already knew about. So these are just some examples of species that we already knew had no close relatives, and therefore their DNA contained a lot of information that was found nowhere else. The lungfish, the ginkgo, the horseshoe crab, etc. Yeah? And we refer to these species as living fossils. But what about which ones in the world have no close relatives and therefore contain a lot of information measured in millions of years. So let's look at mammals. Here's one from Indonesia. If we go back to the tree, we will say, what is the number one most valuable mammal? It's the platypus. So the European platypus is the most valuable mammal in terms of biodiversity measured in millions of years. It's number one. The number two is the aardvark, which is found in southern Africa. And guess what? The number three most valuable mammal in the entire world lives in Indonesia. It is the pen-tailed tree shrew. So you are in charge of one of the most valuable mammals on Earth. We look at sharks. So we look at sharks as well. We built a tree of sharks. There's only 1,200 species. Represents 37 billion years of evolution. It's a very old group. And we can do exactly the same thing. We can ask which species is the most valuable. The number one is this, panray, lives in the Atlantic Ocean. The number two species is endemic to Australia. But the number three species in the world is also found in Indonesia. It's the six-gilled stingray. So you have the number three mammal, and you have the number three shark, most valuable. If we look at birds, this is the tree of birds. Again, we can ask which species is most valuable. The number one species is called the oil bird. It lives in South America. It lives like a bat, so it lives in a cave. It's nocturnal. And the reason it's called an oil bird is because it is so oily that you can simply light it on fire and use it as a torch. As I say, it looks just like a bat. It's fruit. The number two most valuable bird in the world is called the hoatzin. Also lives in South America. It is special because it is like a cow. It is the only bird that eats leaves and digests the leaves in its tummy just like a cow. So it's like a cow bird. The other cool thing about the hoatzin, this is a baby hoatzin. The baby hoatzins have hands. So this baby hoatzin, it lives in wet forests like we have here. And it often falls into the rivers, and it has tiny claws that help it crawl out of, on its wings. It actually has tiny claws, little hands, that help it crawl out of the water. Guess what? The number three most valuable bird in the world also lives in Indonesia. In Java, it is the magpie goose. So, Indonesia has top 5 mammal, top 5 shark, and top 5 bird. This is a map of the world that shows where those evolutionarily isolated, highly valuable species live. The redder the color, the higher proportion of species are very valuable. And you'll see Australia is full of them. But so is the island of Guinea. And you'll see your island, Borneo, there also is quite red. So a large proportion of the bird species, this is just for birds, that are here on this island are considered to be valuable using this new measure of biodiversity. So that is an honor and a responsibility for your island and your country. What about species at risk? Which species that are at risk, which ones of those are also valuable because of the information that they contain? So we can use the International Red List That's the international, there's an organization in Switzerland and in the UK that organizes and scores species for whether they're at risk of extinction. So we can take a look at those species that are considered at risk and ask if they're valuable, how valuable are they? So there are about 600 species considered to be at some level of risk, birds. Here are the top 5. Well, here are 4 of the top 5. The giant ibis, which lives in Laos, Cambodia. The kagu, which lives in New Caledonia. The plains wanderer, which lives in Australia. And the California condor, which almost went extinct. And the Americans spent hundreds of millions of dollars bringing back from extinction that lives in the Southwest. The number 3 most valuable at-risk species is a species called the New Caledonian owlet night trout. And guess what? That species has not been seen for over 50 years. It is considered a lost species. So we don't know whether it's at risk. We don't know if it's extinct. We don't know if it's doing well. It just hasn't been seen in 50 years. And it turns out there are many such lost species. So a lost species is a species that we cannot do anything about until we find it again. It's not extinct, and it's not extant. It's not living. And indeed, Certatus echidna, which is one of the echidnas, it is an Indonesian species that has not been seen since 1961. And if you look at this map, this is a map of where lost vertebrate species are. Birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And which country is the reddest? Which country is the reddest on that map? Raise your hand if you know. Besides Peru. It's your country. Indonesia is the reddest country on that map. Oh, you can't see the... There are 69 species in Indonesia that have not been seen in over 50 years. Out of 560 total in the world. So over 10% of the species of vertebrates that have not been seen in 50 years live in your country. Hopefully still live in your country. So one major undertaking for the future is for people, maybe some of you, if you are interested, to go and try to find these lost species. Because we need to know what their status is. So that was just a parenthesis. So now, I've now told you how we can organize our thinking about preserving biodiversity using information content measured as millions of years. And some of you may be saying, well, why should we? Why should we do that? What's the purpose of this information content conservation? And this is the last part of the talk. And it's just an argument for why we should do this. Remember, this information is about solved problems in evolution because the species are still extant. They're still alive. So these are successful species, and therefore the information they carry is useful. It's useful for evolution, but maybe it's also useful for us. The thing is, we're not using that information now. So this is information that might be useful for us in the future. This is the strongest argument for preserving this information. This is the idea that there are things out there that you don't know you need right now. Well, once you discover them, you thought, why didn't I think of that? Like an inflatable top or having a nap at your office. Right? Things you didn't know you needed or wanted. Here's the famous example of that principle in biodiversity. I hope you can see this. This is a mother frog with a baby frog jumping out of its mouth. How does that work? What happens? This is called a gastric routine frog. She lays eggs, the male fertilizes the eggs, she then eats the eggs, takes them into her tummy, turns off her stomach, stops eating, and the babies grow just like we have pregnancies, women. She then lets the babies grow inside her stomach because she's turned her stomach off, stops eating them. The babies hatch, and then she spits them back out. They're so perfectly safe. That's what you're seeing there, is a baby from mom's tummy. There are two species that do that. Both live in Australia. When people discovered this, they were very excited because this is unheard of, that an animal can turn off its entire digestive system. And the medical community was very interested in studying this frog to help with ulcers and other diseases of the stomach. Like what chemicals are being produced, what genes are being turned on, turned off, etc. Well, it turns out that both of those species went extinct in the 1980s in Australia before they could start to study. That is a value that we lost because we let something go extinct. And we refer to future values as optional values. And this is just a quote from a paper that motivates a lot of this work. That species that contribute more to genetic diversity, which is what I'm calling information content, have higher value because they are likely to have things that other species do not. Because they have more independent, unique evolutionary information that isn't shared with other species, like your orangutans. We don't know what that information, we don't know how valuable that information may be, but we need to preserve those species in particular because they contain this non-redundant, unique information. So if we go back to the hoatzin, which I said was the only bird that ruminates like a cow and a deer, right? Cows and deer, they just eat a lot of grass, and they sit around and they digest it, and they actually get nutrition out of it. The hoatzin does that as well. And the U.S. Department of Energy is funding research to try to figure out how that hoatzin does that, because it's one of the few examples outside of the mammals where this is possible. So this is a value. No other bird does this. We know that from natural history, but it's predicted because it has it scores high on our information content values metric, our millions of years of independent evolution metric, and indeed, we don't know, but it may be valuable for us in the future. Novel enzymes, biofuel applications. Right? There may be something in the hoatzin gut that we can use to produce biofuel, which will be very good for the planet, potentially. And I am pointing out that this approach, pioneered by my students and colleagues in the lab, is actually implemented in an international conservation program, a multi-million-pound international conservation program. So the idea of conserving the tree of life, focusing on millions of years of evolution as a metric of conservation, metric of biodiversity, metric of value, is in fact what the Edge of Existence program does at the London Zoo. So if any of this is interesting, I encourage you to find the Edge of Existence website, where there's a short video that probably says everything that I've just said, but better, explaining the approach and how they are raising money to do conservation for those particular species that have high value. And there's lots of technical questions that I leave for now, but there's lots going on the research side to make these approaches more robust and more precise as well. So this is called the Edge of Existence program, evolutionarily distinct, globally unique. So really, the question isn't what to let go when we're talking about conservation. It's about what not to let go. Which species do we really have to make sure that we focus on so we don't lose the solved evolutionary problems that are represented in the phylogenetic tree. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions, and Ruth is going to help me with questions. Thank you very much.
Kalau ada pertanyaan, silakan. Seperti masih saya juga.
Pertama, saya Wijaya dari program studi bisnis mau menanyakan tentang evolusi dan biologi. Saya mau nanya, kenapa hewan yang berada di daerah bekas ledakan nuklir Chernobyl, Ukraina itu masih dapat hidup dan berkembang biak? Padahal kata para ilmuwan, daerah tersebut sudah terkena zat radioaktif dan tidak bisa dikatakan hidup. Dan juga kenapa di daerah Fukushima, perairan Jepang yang terkena efek ledakan nuklir dan limbahnya tercemar ke laut itu masih kayak hewan kayak ikan itu masih bisa hidup di laut tersebut, sedangkan laut tersebut sudah tercemar zat limbah radioaktif dari PLTN Fukushima yang meledak pada tahun 2011. Sekian, terima kasih. Apakah hewan tersebut mengalami evolusi?
That is a very good question. So I don't know very much about it, but I do know that when you have species that have many, many individuals, you can have a lot of death, the species will still persist. So after, certainly, after Chernobyl, for instance, the individuals that were very close to that event, almost all of them died instantly, very quickly. So individuals can die. Many species have, or there are common species that have very large population sizes, so a few of them will survive. And those that survive and can avoid that, for something, for just good luck, will have babies and then those populations can grow. Now there's a constant continue variation, which increases the mutation rate.
Let me set
So
example.
those populations will still have a lot of death of individuals, but different from humans. So for humans, we don't expect 90% of our babies to die. We expect all of our babies to survive to adulthood. In the past, maybe it was 50%. For many animals, 99% death of your babies is expected, right? So in a lot of species, you can get rid of large, early stages, you expect a lot of death. Whether that death is due to disease or due to radiation, it doesn't matter. So it has to do with the biology of the species. Some species will do very poorly. Certainly the ones where all the babies have to survive because they have very few babies, so big things. The small things will do well because they make millions of babies. If 99.99% will die and 99.9% of those because of radiation, it still doesn't matter. You only need a few winners because they give lots of babies to the next generation. There are also species that for some reason, this is not very well known, that are more resistant to radiation, the DNA is more resistant to radiation than others. And that's very interesting question. That's the part that people don't really understand.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, Gastric. I'm a student of Management of Water Research and Faculty of Agriculture. And I want about in our place in this area we have as you say we have a pongo or orangutan, and you have say about the lost species before, right? And I just want to ask you about if there are some species is lost. So we have more or mining that species that you show us on the screen, right? And that's not all the species can we control or see. Like we have to make a more research, right? So I just want to ask you about the low species there. How if in our places, and especially in London, that we have famous species there is like orangutan, and how if we have the other endemic species there that we have not known about this before. And I just want to ask you how we can how can we make the research of that, and how can we learn more about this, and especially about the evolution, about the thing that we have not seen before. I mean, yeah. Maybe you can understand because my English.
If I understand the question correctly, you're asking about the relationship between conserving species we know about and conserving species we do not know about. Is that a reasonable short?
And she's wondering how to go about doing research to find those lost species.
And you also addressed the lost species. Okay, great. I'm happy you picked that up. Searching for lost species is, I think, critical. So let's just talk about the lost species. As I say, there are at least 70 in Indonesia. The way that one would do that is to find local experts in that group. So if it's a bird, you would say, we have to do two things. We have made a database of where it was last seen. Was it in Sulawesi? Was it northern Borneo? Was it somewhere in Aceh? Somewhere. So we know where it was last seen, even though it was 50 years ago. So then we have to find local experts the local expert in frogs or the local expert in mammals, talk to them, get as much information about where people have looked, where they haven't gone, and then you have to actually mount an expedition. You actually have to raise money and go for a week and look and survey. It's called doing a survey. And there are experts that all over the world, local experts, national experts, and international experts who would love to go look for lost species. They just didn't know that they were lost. So the important thing is to name them and then find experts and say, look, there is a species of mammal in Borneo that hasn't been seen in 50 years. This is what it's called. This is where we saw it last. Can you help us? And people will go look because they're very interested in this. And there's a lot of interest at the international level to try to organize to do these sorts of surveys. So it will happen. But local people have to sort of raise the flag, raise their hands and come help us find this lost species.
I have some more questions. About the local experiences people. How if they have more ignorance about that species? If there's something new or unseen species but the expert that doesn't really interested in that, and we as the college student don't even know how to make something new because the ignorance, the people ignorance about that. So the first step that we can do as a college student for doing that, or maybe the other local people interested in that.
You're absolutely right. That's the first thing you can do. I should say, I meant to say, that many of these lost species are lost to science. But the local people know that they're still there. There was a famous bird that was rediscovered recently. It's called a pigeon pheasant. One of the islands here in Indonesia. It was on our list as had not been seen in 50 years. So people went, and they just walked, and they went from village to village, and eventually they went to a village, and the villager said, of course, it's right there, we've seen it, it's always been there. And they brought them up, and they put out a camera, and 3 days later they found it. So when I say lost, I don't mean that it's lost necessarily to the local people, but it hasn't been recorded scientifically for over 50 years. And so that's why I said local people, you have to go to the local people and say, this is the lost species, and they can say, no, it's not. And then you can go find it, and then it doesn't become lost anymore. And that's very important that we know what's going on so we don't waste money, pretend it's extinct, or cut down the forest where it lives because we didn't know it was there and then it goes extinct, right? So that's very hard. That's why I have to start with the local.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you. Ada pertanyaan lagi?
Good morning, Prof. Morse and fellow participants. My name is Nia. I'm a law student at Universitas Kansula. Firstly, I want to thank to Prof. Morse for kindly sharing this important information to us about what is prioritizing to be conserved and important to keep the forest as much as possible. But I want to ask a question. In one hand, recording the DNA of species or recording the information of species, in one hand, we can get a lot of information, like maybe in the future we can look for the cure for some disease, maybe the cure for cancer or AIDS, or maybe the upcoming disease that has no cure today. But in the other hand, like maybe it's so silly. Like in the sci-fi movies, is it possible that scientists make mistakes? like, is it possible that scientists, instead of making the cure for disease, they make it for like a mutant or something like that? Or, yeah, I want to ask that question. Because, like in the second movies, the story tells that the disaster comes from either the government didn't hear the scientists, or the scientists make this mistake by themselves. Okay, thank you.
Yes. So the general theme, if I understand that question, is that we can preserve information, and that information may be useful, but that information may also not be useful, and may actually be the opposite of useful. And that is a strong argument against option value. Because preserving biodiversity means also preserving things that are not helpful for humans. In the future, we may not know which is which. So I did not discuss other reasons for preserving information. There are other reasons, and that do not have to do with the future, but have to do with the present. Because I thought option value would be a more interesting argument for this particular audience. But it is true that ecosystems that have more information in them produce more ecosystem services than systems that do not. In other words, if you have a field with plants, just a meadow, and you ask, how much forage can I produce? Right? How much grass can I produce in that meadow? If I cut it down in years to feed my animals, then a meadow that has more of this sort of information the way that I have described it produces more grass than one that has less. And there are experiments to show that. So that's a situation where we don't have to worry about unknown future benefits and disadvantages. We only have to consider current value to us. And that argument still holds that information is a good predictor. It's a better predictor than the number of species. So it's not just that there are more species in that meadow, and so it grows higher and you get more grass. It's that the species are more different one from the other. And therefore, they grow at different times of the year, they use different nutrients, they don't compete as much, and the whole system is better. So that's another argument for this way of conceptualizing biodiversity that's independent of your disinformation. There are good arguments against using option value for exactly, not for the science fiction part of it, but for the reason that preserving something for the future, maybe it's useful, maybe it harbors a terrible disease like COVID, right? And you don't know. So what do you do when you don't know? That's a whole different, you're in law, you understand, that's a whole different set of arguments that we're going to discuss about how do you make decisions with limited information. So I think it's a very good point that you raised. And scientists are wrong all the time, of course.
Thank you. Ada lagi? Okay.
Excuse me. Good evening, Professor. Thank you for coming and give us knowledge about tree of life and evolution. I have a question about we human as species are, in my opinion, somehow we tempered with the natural law of evolution. Like looking fallout that if I'm not mistaken, there are type of fungi or mushroom that somehow evolved to eat radiation. Do you think that we human as a species is a good thing that we temper with evolution or not? And how we may increase or decrease our influence in the tree of life? Thank you, sir.
So tree of life. That has been discussed, that is being discussed more and more. Until about, I would say, a decade ago, most scientists believed that humans had very limited impact on the future of the tree of life, barring nuclear catastrophe. But now we know that that's not the case because of climate change. So indirectly, humans are having a huge effect on the future of the tree of life. So what the tree is going to look like in the future will be different because of what we've been doing for the past 200 years. But different is not necessarily worse, it's just different. So that's one part of your question. The other part is about active influence on the evolution of particular lineages, which we all know we've been doing since we started to domesticate animals. So we've been changing the course of evolution of individual species forever. So no change there. What people are concerned about is genetic engineering, where we take a species and we change that species deliberately by changing its DNA. Yes? That is a difference in degree, but not a difference of kind from what we've done in the past. Yes? There is a school of thought that taking a gene from one species and putting it in another species is somehow immoral. Very different from just breeding a species, which we do all the time. We've been breeding better rice and better meat, better cows and better sheep, and better papayas for all forever. But some people really get excited and upset and worried by the thought that we can take a gene from a bacterium and put it in a pig, or take a gene from a human and put it in a pig, which we've done already. Those ethical questions are above what we say, where I come from, are above my pay grade. I do not have the training, the ethical training, the philosophical training, or the training in law to really have a public opinion about whether that is good or bad. But I do know that people really, really worry about genetic engineering for other species and also for humans. I would start with humans. I would ask the question, are we allowed to put a new gene into a baby before it's born from someone else? Right? To genetically manipulate our own offspring. I think we have to deal with that question before we deal with the question that we deal with other species. So I think it's a very, very good question. Scientists can often be wrong. I don't think it's it's not up to science to have an opinion about those things. Those are ethical issues that politicians and philosophers and social scientists have to answer. So I'm not dodging the question, I'm just saying I don't have the expertise to be able to say anything really particularly useful. Except that we have been changing the DNA of species ever since we figured out that we could. 10,000 years. Easy. We've already done it. The fact that we're doing it with test tubes now is a difference in kind, but not equality. That would be my only comment.
Thank you. Ada lagi? Okay.
Good morning, Professor. We're pleased to have you here in this university. My name is Deborah I'm in second year of my law school. I have a very, very simple question. Do you know any animals or mammals that are extinct and scientists are sorry to lose and trying to bring it back? If you could explain specifically why. Thank you.
Fantastic question. There's a whole sub-field in my conservation biology arena called de-extinction, where people are using genetic techniques, like we talked about here, to try to bring species that have gone extinct back to life. So it is actually happening. They have started with a very small mouse, I think it's an Australian mouse, where they've taken the DNA from a museum specimen, so dead. You know, they had a piece of extracted the DNA, and they've been trying to put the DNA into the cells of a live mouse to try to recreate that mouse. So that they started with a mouse because nobody really cares about mice, but there are a couple of species that people really care about. One of them is the Biodiversity in Australia, which is the largest predator. It looked like a wolf. It lived in Australia. Last one alive died in the early 1900s in a zoo. They preserved that. An individual throws it. They've got really good DNA, and there are people who are trying to figure out if they can bring that species back to life because it was a famous extinction because it happened in the middle of London. People could see that last animal lying right there. They knew it was going to extinct. They couldn't do anything about it. It was just one male. So that's one. The other is the woolly mammoth that used to live all across Siberia in northern Canada. That one's very interesting. They've got the gene, they've been able to sequence the entire genome. They've been able to put that genome, parts of it, into elephant cells, and they actually believe that they could have either an Indian elephant or an African elephant give birth to something that had a bunch of genes from the woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth was much bigger, and it was red hair, and it was woolly. And there are groups at major universities around the world working on de-extincting the woolly mammoth. Why? Because it turns out that when you have that large, very large herbivores like the mammoth up in Siberia, in the northern steppes, it completely changes the ecosystem. It makes it much more productive. So it goes from being a grassland to being a shrubland, which is much more productive, holds more water, more plants. It's something, and some people think it would be a better place to live if there were woolly mammoths on the landscape. Very, very controversial because it's very expensive, and again, there are very, very strong important ethical questions about whether we should create these monsters. These would not be extinct species because they would be part extinct species and part elephant, or part, living mouse and part extinct mouse. The Biodiversity, I'm not sure how to do it. But anyway, many ethical questions. There's a very good book called The Extinction, written by you're just like the book, which goes through all the arguments and all the science behind it. So it is a very active area of discussion and scientific activity. It's a very good question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Ada lagi?
Ayo silakan teman-teman mahasiswa pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa, nanti akan diterjemahkan. Silakan dari sebelah kiri. Halo, Mas Kuko.
Hilang kuku, Pak. Kabur.
Ya, siapa yang mau nanya lagi? Teman-teman sebelah kanan.
Oke, thank you. Terima kasih semua.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Anmons. Give applause for Prof. Anmons and Mr. Oke, selanjutnya dari Universitas Santa Kusuma. Will give you some souvenir, like a certificate from Rector, and it will be given by Mr. Wilhelm Tarto as a hero kerjasama and system informasi. Please, aku forward. Okay. Okay, di propose I want to take some picture. Okay. Okay, thank you. Selanjutnya mungkin kita akan foto bersama ya teman-teman ya. Kita foto bersama. Jadi kamu dari Prof. Arne akan ada di sana dan fotografer akan foto dari sana dan teman-teman bisa berdiri. Kita foto bersama, oke? Oke, please Prof. Arne and Miss Blue, maybe we can to take some picture with audience and okay, we can stand here and the photograph will send to the podium. Okay, please stand up, your audience.
Mohon perhatian sebentar. Ini ada aksen yang kita adakan. Tolong tanda tangan ya, cepat aja. Karena ini menjadi bukti kita ada kegiatan nasional. Ya, cepat karena sudah sini belum lagi tanda tangan semua. Gak usah pakai teman-teman kita dulu ya. Cepat saja, oke? Karena mau langsung dibawa ini.
Bisa apa kak? Enggak kursi. Naik kok kursi. Mundur mana? Ya. Kak ketok kabeh gak apa-apa.
1, 2, 3.
Oke, sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke, gaya bebas ya. 1, 2, 3. Aman? Oke, thank you. Terima kasih.
Oke, kita terakhirnya bersama tadi kita terakhir juga kegiatan kita hari ini dan teman-teman bisa kembali ya. Oke, dan stepnya ada di bawah ya teman-teman ya. Teman-teman yang ada di sini, stepnya ada di bawah. Yang belum pesen silakan mengisi absensi. Terima kasih semuanya. Selamat siang.
Teknik absennya mau di mana? Udah. Karena itu kalau tolong kalau ketemu bawa ke fakultas lah. Hah? Ya yang absen fakultas taruh di loketku lah kalau ketemu. Perkumpulan apa ini?
Perkumpulannya saya
bahasa Inggris pun cenderung ngeri gitu ternyata juga bukaan
Mungkin mau mas ini cara buka takut nang arah kono tapi wonge ngarah nang rono ya mas. Aku malah gak kepikiran ngomong no etik. Pak Anung. Aku nyekel kamera, gak iso.